Hi, and welcome to this series where I'm going to be going through the ITIL 4 practices individually, and I'll be giving you the main headline points you need to be aware of in order to help you build your base knowledge around ITIL 4. I'll also discuss some of my real world applications of this practice in the various organisations I've worked within. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like, and click that bell for the updates. Okay, so let's get to it. Today I'm going to be covering off service continuity management, and that's within the service management practice. A reminder about a practice: it's a set of organisational resources which are designed for performing work or for accomplishing an objective. ITIL 4 moves more of the emphasis and the focus on some of these practices to the individual organisation, to the company, in order to implement specific processes that are going to work within your specific ecosystem, your environment that you're working in. It outlines best practice in terms of what you should think about, but there is an emphasis there around you need to adapt to what's going to work in your environment. Okay, so let's get straight down to some definitions and some terminology when it comes to service continuity management. What's the purpose? Well, service continuity management practice is to ensure that the availability and the performance of a service are maintained at a sufficient level in case of a disaster. What's a disaster? Well, I'll come on to that in a minute. The practice provides a framework for building organisational resilience within the capability of producing an effective response that safeguards the interests of your key stakeholders and the organisation's reputation, its brand, and its various value creating activities. So, okay, so what is a disaster then? It's a sudden, unplanned event that causes great damage or serious loss to an organisation, results in an organisation failing to provide critical business functions for some predetermined minimum period of time. If you think, when we talk about disasters, think flooding, think earthquake, think tornado, or it could be a security break in or a breach of some kind. That means those services are not available anymore. More on that in a few minutes. You may also have heard terms like RTO, RPO, DR plans, BIA. What's that all about? Well, RTA stands for Recovery Time Objective, and that's the maximum acceptable period of time following a service disruption, whatever that may be, that is allowed to elapse before a lack of business functionality severely impacts the organisation. Basically, it represents the maximum agreed time within which a product or an activity must resume or the resources must be recovered one way or the other. RPO talks about recovery point objective. Now, that's the point to which information's used by an activity must be restored to enable the activity to operate or to resume. So it's basically the point at which that activity must be restored in order to operate and resumption of service. DR plan, so disaster recovery plan, that's a clearly defined plan relating to how an organisation will recover from a disaster, as well, and that's an important point, as well as return to a pre-disaster condition. So back to where we were before whatever happened. That clearly needs to consider the 4 dimensions of service management. Of course, you remember those. That's the organisation and people, information and technology, the partners and suppliers, and value streams and processes. And I hear you say, don't forget about the PESTLE factors. Absolutely. You've got those political, economical, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors that are all surrounding those dimensions. Okay, and then BIA, business impact analysis. So this is a key activity in the practice of service continuity management, that it identifies those functions, and there's a term, vital business functions, VBFs, and those dependencies. So that's a really key point. Now I'm going to repeat that. It's a key activity in the practice of service continuity management. What you're doing is you're looking within your own organization, your own business, and you're finding those functions that are absolutely critical, absolutely vital for your organization to continue. Not only that, you're then looking at those dependencies that relate to that. These dependencies might include third parties, suppliers, people, other dependencies in terms of business processes. Of course, IT services are in that mix as well. And then the BIA defines the recovery requirement for IT services. So what is needed in order to resume those services, and that includes the RTOs that we just covered a minute ago, the recovery time objectives, the RPOs, the recovery point objectives, and some kind of minimum target service level for each of those IT service. Having gone through a number of disaster recovery and service continuity activities, service levels are there, but it's usually aimed at, okay, well, this is the minimum level of service that we're now going to provide. Service continuity supports the overall BCM, so that's the business continuity management and planning capability, by ensuring the IT and services can be resumed when required, and an agreed business timescale following a disaster or a crisis. So there's a lot of communication there within the business as to what are the timescales here. Maybe there's a priority in terms of resumption of which services come back first. My experience, unfortunately, I have experience in this area. Typically, we've seen it come through as a major incident on the service desk function. So there's a disruption of some kind. The risk has already occurred, and it's quite clear that the business, the organisation, isn't going to be able to handle this as part of normal day-to-day service, and there needs to be some form of flag that's raised to say this is a P0. It's not a P1. It's even more serious than a P1. And that is an organisational event that is of such a magnitude, we refer to that as a disaster. In terms of ITIL4, think through some of those other practices that are involved in this. So change, for example, the change management and change enablement practice. Think through things like, well, there may be documentation that needs to be updated or changed or enhanced. There may be technology enhancements as part of service continuity. We need to add another data center. We need to add another piece of equipment within the data center, or we need to add another box of some kind that adds extra resilience. Clearly, incident management loops into this practice as well. We've mentioned about the major incident management, a P0 suddenly coming in, a P1. The monitoring and event management practice, architecture management, security practices, risk management, strategy, capacity, performance, validation and testing. These are practices from first-hand experience as a result of service continuity management I've been involved in, and we've had to have inputs into there. Service continuity management doesn't need to be particularly complex. I can think of a recent example that happened a number of years ago that I quite like to use just as a bit of an analogy around explaining what is continuity management. We had a power cut at home, and basically what had happened is the cable that provides the electricity to our village, we were snowed in to such an extent it actually snapped one of the overhead cables. So if you think that through, so the service is electricity, we consume electricity. and it wasn't being delivered to the customer, i.e., we had no power. Um, the electricity company, lots of alarms and bells would have gone off to say there's a break, there's an issue. They also would have had a number of customers calling in to complain to say, hey, look, we've lost power. The service that we are consuming, your product, the electricity, you're not delivering it to us as a service, and it's having quite a serious ramification. We have no power at all. So the electricity company will make an assessment. They will look at it. Clearly, they're going to say, okay, can we fix this quickly? Do we know what the problem is? Are we able to fix this, say, in an hour? Do we understand it? There will be an element of continuity there that will say, okay, if we can't fix this, what do we do? Is there a way of rerouting it perhaps? Can it come in via a different direction? Can we flick a switch somehow? Can we put a temporary cable up? Is there perhaps a generator answer around this? Maybe we put a generator in to route power. And then eventually the electricity company, they will execute those plans. They will send a team out to repair the cable or put the generator in place, which is what happened. Actually, they put a generator in place, and then that ran temporarily while they fixed the cable, and then normal service was resumed. Don't just think technology failure. So clearly that springs to mind when we think about service continuity, but think it through in a much wider context. Think service provider failures, vendor failures, third party failures, also known supply chain failures. So if kit's not getting through or a service is not going through. Also, think through if power. We talked about power, and the importance around service providers and vendors and third parties leads quite nicely in terms of my particular point. I always quite like to stress is the importance of doing regular due diligence on your supply chain. Just make sure, is everything okay with them? Do they themselves have continuity plans and practices, and do they test them? So think much wider in terms of just technology. Think your supply chain. Think about power. So I gave an analogy of power at home. Think about water. Many years ago I worked in an office building where for whatever reason water wasn't able to get to the building, so they had to send everybody home. It wasn't a big office particularly, but the point was suddenly hundreds of people had to work at home. Now in these days of COVID, working at home and remote is kind of yeah, we've got a good mature working model in terms of remote working technology. At this point, this particular organization didn't have that, so the idea of everyone not being able to get into the office actually meant there was about 60% of the workforce couldn't technically work because they had a desktop PC and that PC was in the office. So just think in a much wider sense as to how do you address some of these disaster what are your continuity practices? Think through terrorism. Think through the weather. What about floods? What happens if a flood happens? What happens if a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake, a fire happens? What about security? Maybe a cyber attack of some kind, or if there were to be a biological hazard of some kind, or a health risk. Maybe even and this almost kind of talks around some of these pestle factors here and the four dimensions. What about political stability? What about economical crisis of some kind? What about public order? Think through what would the impact be there. Is it income? Is it dollars? Is it a reputational damage of some kind? Maybe there's a competitor advantage there that either or a disadvantage that could have a serious consequence on the operation of the business. Maybe a breach of regulation. So perhaps something's happened and the result of that would mean you're unable to do business in this sector anymore. That's a serious issue. Likewise, a breach of law or financial crime or fraud of some kind. Do think much wider in terms of disasters. Clearly, there comes a point at which you have to say it's impossible to work out every combination of what potentially could go wrong. But having all of these written down at least gives you something that you can look at. Well, what's the probability of something happening? Let's just talk around the service value chain very briefly. So service value chain, as a reminder, it's at the center of the service value system. Service value system, guiding principles, governance, service value chain, right in the center. You've got your practices and your continual improvement. The value chain consists of a number of activities, and I always remember these as PIDOD, which is planning, improve, engage, design and transition, obtain and build, deliver and support. That in turn makes your products, it makes your services, it delivers those, and that delivers that value to the customer. In terms of business continuity management and the practice, it's involved in all of those activities. Just a very quick parting thought. Make sure you test your continuity plans. Certainly in some of the organisations I've worked in, specifically regulatory environments, you need to actually show you are doing tests and that you have thought through your continuity activities as a risk assessment. And certainly in some organisations, I've been asked for, can we see your testing plan? We actually want to see your testing plan and your resulting output document of how did it go? What are you going to do to address some of those activities that you found didn't perhaps go as planned? It's all about safeguarding business interests. Okay, that's it. Please subscribe. I'll continue to post videos around the ITIL 4 practices. Thank you.